Today is May 14, 2022, and the Tucson Astrologers Guild is proud to present Nick Dagan Best, coming to us from South Africa. What a privilege it is to be able to have you on our Zoom today, Nick. His topic is going to be about Russia and the Venus Synodic cycle. Nick is an amazing astrological historian. He spoke for TAG once in person, and I found him fascinating. Please put your hands together and welcome Nick to the Zoom. Take it away.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Gail. Thank you, everyone. Yes, indeed, it was 9 years ago that I showed up in Tucson and gave a talk on Uranus for you guys, mostly about Uranus and Gemini and American history. But we're looking at a different country today. I'm going to get myself set up here. There we are. Okay, so the subtitle of today's talk is The Rhythm of Venus, an introduction to Neo-Babylonian astrology and planetary synodic cycles. When I say Neo-Babylonian astrology, it's a bit tongue-in-cheek. I mean, I'm half serious, half not serious with that tagline, because, of course, no one really knows what Babylonian astrologers were doing. Not really. We have some idea what they were probably doing. We have some idea of some of the things they believed and wrote down and accomplished, but it's still quite a gray area. But the kind of work I'm doing here in the 21st century with my laptop and assorted technologies is something like what I think Babylonian astrologers would have been doing all those millennia ago, basically following without because, of course, the Babylonians were pre-horoscopic astrologers. They weren't necessarily looking at the birth chart of a given individual and trying to read the entire life of that individual or look at their transits. It was something much sort of simpler in that sense. And while I am a horoscopic astrologer, a modern horoscopic astrologer, I use another approach when looking at synodic cycles, one that doesn't necessarily require that I have, a birth chart with a time and all that in order to glean information about a person or an event. I'm really just following the pattern of Venus itself, which makes a really fascinating symmetrical outline in the way it records time. So I'm going to sort of get into that and get into how I've been using the Venus synodic cycle to study history and applying it just a couple of little areas regarding Russian history that'll sort of help us look at the present with a little more perspective. One thing I do really like using this work for is looking at long spans of history. Spans that are broader than really just even looking at a Pluto return from 250 years ago. And the wonderful thing about Russian history is it does go back quite a considerable distance. So I can look at a picture from a sort of a broad view. And indeed, the other exciting and interesting thing about looking at Russia with astrology, well, it's a very old country. I'm looking at the three most recent regimes. That is the Romanov dynasty from the 1600s to the middle of the First World War, then the Bolsheviks, the communists who were in power from 1917 until 1991, and then the new sort of Russian Republic that was led first by Boris Yeltsin and now by Vladimir Putin, with a little interregnum in the middle of his reign. So you have these three very different regimes, and typically what horoscopic astrologers would be inclined to do is to cast a chart, say for like the current regime, cast a chart for when it when it was incorporated, and look at all the transits and progressions and all the sort of treat that chart like it's an actual nativity, and glean all their astrological knowledge and information regarding Russia from that one chart. And what I'm doing is broader than that. I'm looking at a Russia that isn't defined by a republic chart or by a Bolshevik revolution, or even by like a given imperial regime like the Romanovs. It's something broader. It's something about the part of Russia that remained the same through all those different phases of their history. Now, I've got a ton of research on Russia, and I'm not gonna just throw all that stuff. I can't throw all that stuff at you guys tonight. I can give you, I promise you, just the smallest little taste of everything I've sort of put together, which ultimately I'm wanting to use in a sort of comprehensive astrological work, but probably in a series of YouTube videos is where that's leading. But this is sort of a little preview of what I'm doing, and even with this small little taste, I think you'll appreciate what can be done with Venus in order to study history this way. So without further ado, let's get on with the slideshow. Okay, I don't understand why that's not. There we are. Okay. Okay, let's start at the very beginning. Take a circle. Imagine a circle. Imagine the circle represents 2,920 days. Now divide that circle into 10 equal parts. Split these parts into alternating black and white sections, and voila, you have reproduced the elegant design of the Venus Synodic cycle. So basically, I'll go back here. This circle represents 2,920 days, which is 8 years minus 2 days. So we're taking those 8 years and we're dividing them into 10 equal parts. And those 10 equal parts, I'll explain to you now. Now, this is just a little diagram of the Earth and the Sun. The Earth's orbit moving clockwise there. And now this is Venus's orbit. And we have two kinds of Venus conjunctions with the Sun. They're sort of like lunations in a way. Now we have the exterior, sometimes called the superior conjunction. And this, the Sun-Venus exterior conjunction, occurs when Venus is at its greatest distance from Earth on the opposite side of the Sun. Meanwhile, we also have interior conjunctions, sometimes called inferior conjunctions. And Sun-Venus interior conjunctions occur when Venus is closest to Earth, in between Earth and the Sun. And this is when you get Venus retrogrades. An interior conjunction occurs right in the middle of a Venus retrograde. All right, so basically what I've done when I showed you that circle broken down into 10 of black and white parts, those represent rising and setting phases for Venus. This is a phase circle. Those are those planetary orbits. Now, the setting phase begins following an exterior conjunction, whereas the rising phase begins following an interior conjunction. So in other words, during an exterior conjunction, Venus goes from a rising to a setting phase. During an interior conjunction, in the middle of a retrograde, Venus is going from a setting back to a rising phase. Is that clear so far? Oh, okay. Now, having broken down that 2,920 day period into 10 parts, we can also break it into 20 parts, averaging about 146 days each. This means one of these 20 intervals equals 5% of total time. And I'm giving you that figured, just because I'm going to be concentrating at certain parts on just one of those, 1 out of 20 parts in a concentrated way. And when I outline these, when I outline these series of events that all occur during this one particular part, I want you to have a sense of just what a small percentage of overall time this one given interval makes up. I hope if that doesn't make sense, it will in a minute, or at least I hope it will. All right, so I have this is the 20-part system that I have, and I've broken it into 4 colors. We have the white intervals. These are the rising phases. It's Venus is a morning star. They average 141 to 151 days. So it's an average of 146 days, which is perfectly 1/10 of 2,920 days. And Venus in the white interval is gradually accelerating, gradually headed towards an external conjunction. Following the white intervals, I have the blue intervals. These last exactly 146 days. As I was saying earlier, they mark when Venus goes from a rising to a setting phase, or from morning to evening star. It's a fast, direct motion. It's at its fastest when it's making the conjunction to the sun. And the exterior conjunction is right in the middle of the interval. The interval is calculated by taking the exterior conjunction as a center and splitting off 73 days on either side, making a total of 146 days. Following the blue intervals, we have the black intervals. These are the setting phases. The evening star, Venus is an evening star. They also last an average of 141 to 151 days, and they're gradually decreasing in speed. And did I misspell that? Did I say gradually decreasing in speed? No, gradual deceleration. Okay, so yeah, they're gradually decelerating in speed. And finally, we have the red intervals. The red intervals are 146 days long. They're calculated just like the blue intervals, using the conjunction in the center and splitting out 73 days on either side. In this case, on either side of the interior conjunction. This is slow retrograde motion. I'm sure most astrologers generally know when a planet is making a retrograde, it sort of slows down, stops, turns around, accelerates for a little while till it reaches the sun, then gradually slows down again, then stops again, then turns around and starts moving forward again. So that's what the red intervals represent. So and in this 8-year minus 2-day period, in this 2,920-day period, these 20 intervals repeat ad infinitum over time. In other words, because they're 2 days shy of a perfect 8 years, with every successive return of the Venus synodic cycle, the conjunctions and the places and the position in the zodiac relative to the intervals shifts back about 2 to 3 days and 2 to 3 zodiacal degrees earlier than the previous time. So for instance, if Venus goes retrograde on Christmas Day at 10 degrees Capricorn in one given year, 8 years later, it's going to go retrograde at about 8 Capricorn on December 23rd or 22nd. And over time, that gradually recedes, so that after 120 years, the Venus will actually move back one sign. For instance, we just had Venus retrograde in Capricorn this past winter. That Venus retrograde in Capricorn during the 20th century used to occur in Aquarius, and during the 19th century, it used to occur in Pisces, and so on and so forth. So they all sort of move around. Now, this is the sort of the interval circle. Sorry, I just want to get this player minimized. Let's go ahead. Bear with me. I'm looking for my mouse. Okay, there we are. All right, so this is the interval circle. And you can see that the blue surrounds the exterior conjunction. The red underlines the interior conjunction, and then you have the white and blue intervals on either side, giving you that's one perfect trip around the 4 intervals in the 20-part system. And the other thing about the red interval is that it corresponds very closely to the greatest elongation of Venus. The interval begins with Venus at its greatest western elongation within about a day or so, the way I've calculated them. And then it ends when Venus is at its greatest eastern elongation. So it's very interesting to me that the phase of Venus is even in this sense really perfectly symmetrical, that the periods of its greatest elongations mark sort of a perfect quarter out of this 4-quarter system that I've got. Again, I hope that makes sense, but that's visually speaking, when Venus is at its greatest elongation, it's very bright, and it's the greatest distance from the sun in a horoscopic chart. All right. So, and then when you look at the whole system, that's the whole kit and caboodle here. And now I'm just going to apply it. I'm going to give you guys some idea of how this sort of plays out in history. Now, like I said, I have a bunch of different stories. I'm not going to be able to get to everything now, but I'm just going to touch on some of the really famous ones. People generally know who this man is. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia was the last Romanov Tsar. He was the Tsar during the First World War, which led to the Russian Revolution, led to his overthrow, and then a sort of second revolution by the Bolsheviks, which led to his murder alongside his family, and the creation of the Soviet Union shortly after that, after a civil war and a bunch of other stuff that we don't need to get into. But basically, I want to show you that he was born 37 days before Venus stationed retrograde. So he's very much he's in the red 3 synodic interval. In other words, and he's got Venus in Cancer here. So the red 3 synodic interval, during the 19th century, Venus would go retrograde in Leo during a red 3. And then during the 20th century, it went retrograde in Cancer. These days, the red 3 Venus retrograde goes retrograde through Gemini. So like I was saying, it gradually recedes through the signs over time. But he was born with Venus in Cancer 37 days before the retrograde station. So his progressed Venus would station retrograde as he turned 37 years old. And lo and behold, that happened in the year 1905, which is when the first Russian Revolution began. So you can even just, like with simple secondary progressions, that Venus station marks, if you know your Russian history, sort of like the beginning of the end, even though that was another 12 years before he would actually be overthrown. The onslaught of the Russian Revolution, the inevitability of it really begins in 1905 due to a sort of disastrous war with Japan. So he's a red 3, and I'm going to talk just a little bit about the outbreak of the First World War, because this is part of the thing that's really striking. Remember, I said one specific interval, like the red 3 interval, accounts for 5% of total time. It's just 1 out of 20 of the possible intervals that you can find. When the First World War was breaking out, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife were shot, and there's all these, I'm not going to get into big World War I history. Most of you know the basic details. There's about a month or 6 weeks of finagling. Austria demands an apology. Serbia won't apologize. Austria really wants to invade Serbia anyway. Russia is sworn to protect Serbia, their fellow Slavs. And France is bound to go in a war if Russia winds up in a war. And Britain is kind of also bound in a treaty to go into a war. if Russia and France do, but certainly they're bound to protect Belgium. And then on the other side, you've got Germany and Austria. Germany is bound to go into any war that Austria gets into. So Germany knows that it's got France and Russia on both sides, and so they want to sort of preempt the fighting, and they invade France through Belgium, which brings the Britons in, and boom, you've got yourself a First World War, and then Turkey joins in just a couple of months later. So yeah, I'm sorry to go through all that. You folks probably know that whole part, but I just want to get to the period in time after the shooting of Archduke Ferdinand, before war actually breaks out in August 1914, because I just want to give you an idea of some of the people who are involved in negotiating and ultimately the decision to go to war. So Tsar Nicholas, of course, is an autocrat. He's really just got one foreign minister who he's working with during this crazy period when Russia, along with everyone else, is trying to decide how they're going to react to the shooting of Archduke Ferdinand. And his foreign minister is a guy named Sergei Sazonov, who was also born during a Red 3 interval. So again, I don't know what time he's born. We're not looking at his whole horoscope. I don't know what his rising sign is, but this was his birthday. His birthday is recorded. And just with his birthday, I see, oh, like the Tsar, he was born during a Red 3 interval. And it's really just him and the Tsar who are running the government, at least in terms of, as far as the war is concerned at this point. Now, Russia's main ally is France. And as it happens, the president and prime minister of France are visiting Russia, visiting the Tsar, right in this period after the Archduke Ferdinand is shot and before war breaks out. So you have the Russian president and the Russian prime minister, Russia's main allies. Let's have a look at these guys. The French prime minister, excuse me, I beg your pardon. The French prime minister, whose name is Raymond Poincaré, was also born during the Red 3 interval. And he really is the main man in charge. He does bring along his prime minister, a guy named René Viviani, who was born during a Red 5 interval. But Viviani doesn't have a lot of power, and he's new to the prime ministership and knows virtually nothing about foreign policy. So really, it's Poincaré who does everything. And these men, so here we go. We've got the Tsar, who's a Red 3. We've got Sazonov, who's a Red 3. And we have Poincaré, who's a Red 3. And they're basically deciding, along with a little bit of input from this guy, they're basically deciding what their strategy is going to be. And it's actually kind of a stroke of luck that the Russians and the French, that their leadership are in the same place right at when this crucial moment in history breaks forth. So basically, while we don't have documentation of what was said between these four men, we basically know, that they know they're going to back each other up if things get hairy, which of course they will. Now, the Russians and the French also have another ally, which is the British. And here again, we have a British prime minister and the British foreign minister, and their involvement when England winds up coming into the war, they're going to be the main guys making decisions when all this happens. So let's have a look at the British prime minister. His name is Herbert Asquith, and he was born, again, I don't know his birth time, but he was born during the Red 3 interval. So the Tsar of Russia, the Russian foreign minister, the French president, and the British prime minister, all of whom form like the most central part of the decision-making leadership at the outbreak of arguably the most important war in human history. They're all born during the same Venus interval. You follow me? So again, this is 1 out of 20 division. If I told you, astrologers would be sort of more familiar if I pulled out all these guys' charts and they all had the sun in Aquarius, you'd all be going, oh my God, that's amazing. All these guys are Aquarians, or if they were all Tauruses or anything like that. And that is 1 out of 12. The odds of that happening are 1 out of 12. This is 1 out of 20. It's that much more staggering to find all these different men in these key leadership roles being born in the same interval. And as it happens, the British foreign minister, a guy named Edward Grey, was born during a red 4 interval. He's also pretty important, but everyone's born very, very close to a Venus retrograde, either just before, just after. Like Grey here is born 37 days after. You'll remember the Tsar was born 37 days before. Asquith 31 days after. Viviani 19 days after, so I mean they're all sort of close before and after the retrogrades, but close enough that they fall into, again, what I'm calling these red intervals, where Venus is moving at an erratic speed, either slowing down, speeding up, stopping, turning around again. It's doing any number of these things when these men are born. So that's basically, but wait a minute. There's one other thing I haven't covered, just to get this whole red interval thing complete. There are some other important leadership people involved when this war breaks out. In other words, Tsar Nicholas's cousins, the other kings involved in the powers. Now, of course, France is a republic; they don't have a king, but England has a king. Nicholas's cousin, King George V, who was born during a red 1 interval. So he's another red in the picture. And then Germany, their other cousin, Kaiser Wilhelm, their enemy, their adversary in the war, he was born during a red 2 interval. So all these guys I've just shown you were born at least in one of the red intervals, a whole bunch of the main ones born in the red 3. But just imagine what the odds are of having all these men being born during these intervals. Now, I'm going to cut this part of the story here. I could keep going into all kinds of, other ministers in the government and generals, and it gets more and more interesting as I go into more detail, but I'm going to spare you guys all that. I just wanted to give you a taste, some idea of how this kind of thing plays out and why it's worth following. So this is just a quick, this is the one emperor who's not born during a red interval. And he's not from a very consequential country, although he's from the country that starts the war, basically. Franz Josef of Austria-Hungary. He's born during a white 3 synodic interval. Austria doesn't do very well in the war, even though they kind of start it. They drag Germany into the thing, and Germany, of course, they lose their empire just like Austria does. So this is just a quick run through the war. When Germany does declare war on Russia, it's during a black 3 interval. The Russian Revolution in 1917 begins during a blue 1. The Tsar abdicates, and then during the following black 5, Bolshevik forces siege the Russian Winter Palace, and the Bolsheviks take power. This is shortly before we go into a red 4 interval. And this is going to be important down the road, because red 4 intervals in Russian history are repeatedly really, really powerful. For instance, not only did the Bolshevik Revolution happen in a black 5 leading into a red 4, but the tearing down of the Berlin Wall in 1989 happened as we were going from a black E into a black 5 into a red 4 interval. So was the Communist China Revolution in 1949. Also went from a black 5 to red 4. And just this past winter, we were in a red 4 when Putin had his troops lining up on the Ukrainian border all through the last months of 2021. We were in a black 5 interval, and the war broke out during a red 4 interval, as did the annexation of the Crimea 8 years ago, also during a red 4. But I'll get into more of that. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. I wanted to just talk about another episode in the Romanovs story, which is the murder of the family, because there's some interesting. I'm sorry, this is I'm bringing up a very disturbing event here, and that photo is kind of disturbing. Maybe well, there's no way to sort of dress this up, because we are talking about war, and some grisly things are happening as we speak. But this is about the murder of the Romanov family in 1918 after the revolution. It occurs during a white 3. But there's some very interesting things. These are 10 of the victims. There's an 11th victim for whom I don't have a birthday, but out of the 10 people who were shot in this basement, I have birthdays for 10 of them. This is the 5 on top. The red 3 is Tsar Nicholas II. The red 5 is his oldest daughter, Olga. The red 1 is his second oldest daughter, Tatiana. The red 1 next to Tatiana is Evgeny. I forget his name, but he was the doctor. He was basically the family doctor, shot alongside with them. The lady of the red 4, I think her name is Anna Verubova, but she was the Tsarina's lady in waiting. Then on the bottom row, the blue 3 at the left, that is the Tsarina Alexandra, the empress, the wife of the Tsar. The blue 1 is the famous Princess Anastasia, the one who, supposedly resurfaced after the war by a phony. The blue 3 is the young Tsaritsyn Alexei, the heir to the throne, a hemophiliac child. The family is keeping his hemophilia a secret from the Russian people, and they don't understand why. Well, that's a whole other thing, but anyway, it's part of the reason why the revolution happened. The white 1 is the Princess Marie. She's the only one out of the royal family who wasn't born during a red or a blue, and she is kind of the rebel of the family. In fact, when they're in prison, but before they're murdered, she is reputed to have carried on a romance with the guard, and she's sort of ostracized by the rest of the family for doing this. Finally, the white 4 at the end is the Tsar's footman, the Tsar's sort of personal assistant. So we've got 7 members of the royal family and 3 of their entourage who were murdered in this basement. And as you can see, half of them were born in the red interval, and another 3 are born in the blue interval. So you still see a domination, even in this story, of a particular interval, not a black interval, not not much white interval, but mostly red. These kinds of concentrations I find intriguing. Oh, and the man who murdered them, this is the man who ordered the firing squad who killed them. Remember, they were killed during a white 3, and he was born during a white 3 interval. So, it's even worth looking at the murderer alongside the rest of them. This is just a quick run through their charts. For those of you watching on video, you can sort of freeze frame these and have a better look at them. I'll just run through them and then get to the next subject at hand. Yevgeny Botkin, that's the name. Alexei Trupp, Anna Demidova. I think I gave the wrong name when I was talking about her picture. There are a lot of names to memorize. But anyway, we know who they are, and there they are. Now, there's an interesting thing, just on a sidebar. Of course, a lot of Russian leaders have been assassinated in coups and other plots. This was Tsar Nicholas II's grandfather, Alexander II, who was killed by a bomb in St. Petersburg. And Nicholas himself he was 12 years old, and he saw his grandfather, sort of after the explosion when he was clinging to life. And it's said to have made a deep impression on him. And when you have that perfect hindsight of 2020, and knowing that this 12-year-old boy is seeing his grandfather murdered, that someday he's going to be murdered alongside his family, it really sort of brings home the point. Now, this Tsar was killed during a red 1 interval, and the red 1 interval is actually the one. Remember that 2 of the 10 people killed in the basement, 2 of them were red 1s, even though the murder didn't occur during a red 1. But red 1 has this theme in Russian political murder, and also, I'm going to get to it, American political murder as well. So Tsar Alexander II was killed during a red 1. That's Nicholas II's grandfather. But Alexander II's brother who was the mayor of Moscow, he was also assassinated during a red one. He was also, he wasn't just Nicholas II's uncle, he was also his brother-in-law. They were very close. So this guy was actually born and killed during a red one by a bomb blast. And before that, excuse me again, Alexander II's own grandfather was killed during a red one interval, murdered by his own guards. He was the son of Catherine the Great, who herself was born during a red one interval. So you just like, the red one interval seems to be sort of a hot spot for Russian political murder. Years later, Stalin would die during a red one interval, although, you know, to the best of our knowledge, he wasn't murdered, but just to add to the total there. So there's been a lot of, okay, now I've got a few American presidents here who've died during red ones, some through murder, some not. But you definitely, I've tallied all the deaths of American presidents, natural causes or otherwise. And amazingly, a really high percentage of them died during red one intervals. They include William Henry Harrison, the first president to die in office and also to serve the shortest term, a 30-day term. James Polk died during a red one. Lincoln was shot and killed during a red one. James Garfield was shot during a red one, although he ultimately died during a white five. Franklin Roosevelt died during a red one, just like Stalin, Hitler, Mussolini. Most of those World War II guys died during a red one. And most recently, Dwight Eisenhower died during a red one. That's just a sidebar. I wanted to give you an idea, like there's something weird about that red one stuff. The way it corresponds to not all murders, but a lot of these political murders in the US and Russia. And even other murders, like the murder of McKinley didn't occur during a red one, but his shooter was born during a red one. So it moves from the actual event happening during a red one to the person responsible being doing that. And then of course, everyone wants to know about Kennedy. Kennedy seems to veer off this trajectory for some reason. But of course, Kennedy's still being figured out, isn't he? So maybe when all the data's in, it'll make more sense in that sense. Excuse me again. I'll just pause as I move on to the next thing. This here is a table of all the Russian leaders since Elizabeth I in the mid 1700s. And this just shows what phases they were born under. And you can see there's a reasonably even distribution between them amongst the 10 phases of Venus. But then when I go to the 20-part system, to the intervals, we start to get some really, it's not so evenly distributed. You get a lot more leaders born during certain intervals than others, and certainly a lot more red than any of the others. You can see at the second row down on the far right, Nicholas II was a red 3. He was followed by in the first revolution by Kerensky, who was a red 1. Then of course Lenin, everyone knows who Lenin was. He was a red 4. Trotsky was a red 5. Stalin was a blue 2. Malenkov a red 4. Khrushchev a red 4. Brezhnev a red 2. And then you have a brief, like not even a year, with a black 3 in charge, and then briefly a red 5 in charge. And then the one white 1 is Gorbachev, the guy who again is a standout, is not like any of the other leaders here in the sense that he sort of reforms his country out of existence. Then you get Yeltsin a red 2, and then finally the first black 2 ever is Putin. So you get someone again who's really sort of outside the mold, someone very different from the rest of the leaders. So it's an interesting skewering of the balance of all the different possible intervals and who winds up being in charge of Russia. All right, now down to this guy. Putin is like I said, he's born during a black 2 or black D phase, black 2 interval. This is the black 2 interval. This is his chart so far as we know. Now, there is a very interesting story that has some credibility that he's actually 2 years older than he is, that he was born in Georgia and that his Georgian mother gave him up to a family member living in St. Petersburg, and that was the family who raised him. The last name would not have had to have been changed because, you know, they were family members, so he was born with the name Putin. I don't know what to make of this story. There's some things, you know, there's not enough evidence, but there is some evidence. It is worth mentioning that Stalin went his entire life lying about his actual birth year. There's a wonderful book, Liz Green and Howard Susportis, published in '82 when they were giving workshops. And now, on the plus side, in that book, Liz Green very astutely and impressively says that the Soviet Union will start to fall apart when the Saturn-Neptune conjunction occurs in 1989, which is absolutely true. 7 years ahead of the fact, she sees that coming, and that's impressive. But unfortunately, beyond her control, she's using a birth year for Stalin that is incorrect, and she talks about him having a Mars retrograde in Scorpio and goes at great length of explaining why, you know, Stalin is such a Mars retrograde guy in Scorpio, when it turns out he was not born in 1879, he was born in 1878, and the chart she's describing is not his actual chart. The fact that she does a good job with it anyway is par for the course, of course. But my point being that there is precedent for these, Russian autocrats to lie about their birth years. I don't know why Stalin did. He knew perfectly well when we only found out long after he was dead, after the Soviet Union fell. Historians suddenly had access to all these records and documents that hadn't been available during the years of the Soviet Union. And it was only then that we found out when Stalin was actually born. But they had all kinds of, annual birthday parties for him. He never thought to correct the record. I don't know what his thinking was, if he was trying to thwart astrologers or what have you, but there you go. But so far as we know, this is Putin's birth year. That being said, the stuff I'm about to say about him, again, I'm not going to be going into his horoscope. We're not going to try and figure out if he really has a Scorpio rising or anything like that. I'm just going to be giving you a timeline of events in his life that all correspond to one or two particular intervals in the Venus synodic cycle, and let that speak for itself. So that even if we are looking at the wrong birth chart for Putin, we can glean really interesting, relevant astrological information just from looking at events in his life. So here we go. Here's the thing. We're looking at red 5 intervals. Now this is his mother, or at least the woman that he says is his mother. Maybe she's his adopted mother, as I was explaining just now, but she was born during a red 5 interval. We'll just put that aside for now. We don't know the exact date that Putin enlisted in the KGB, but we know it was right after he finished university in St. Petersburg in 1975. And university in St. Petersburg finishes, much like North America, in the 3rd week of June. So if he finished school in the 3rd week of June, it's during the summer months that he would have enlisted in the KGB. The story goes in all the biographies that that's when he applied and he was hired, because he had graduated with a law degree. So even though we don't know the exact date he joined the KGB, it would have been during a red 5 interval that he enlisted in the KGB. There we are. That's the red 5 interval. He got married 8 years later in 1983 during a red 5 interval. I like to, these personal matters in sort of collide nicely with the big geopolitical ones. So he got married during a red 5 interval in 1983. And then in 1991, he quit the KGB. This is during a red 5 interval. This is an event where some sort of hardline Bolsheviks tried to sort of put Gorbachev out of power. They staged a coup try and reel back the reforms, because they felt quite rightly that the Soviet Union was coming apart. Just on a personal side, on this morning, August 19th, 1991, I was in East Berlin with my brother, sleeping in a youth hostel where we were virtually the only people in this giant apartment complex, very, East German concrete complex. And we woke up in the morning and everyone seemed to be a bit panicked. And we got on the train back to West Berlin, and everyone was reading newspapers about Gorbachev, and they seemed very alarmed. And it was because this coup was staged and people didn't know how it was going to play out. It played out okay. That the coup was thwarted thanks to Yeltsin, Boris Yeltsin, who would succeed Gorbachev as president. But it was because of this coup that Putin quit the KGB. He resigned and went into public service, started working for the mayor of Petrograd, which would again be called St. Petersburg before long. It was Leningrad. It had changed names a few times. It was Leningrad, and then it got changed back to St. Petersburg when the Soviet Union fell. Long story short, Putin joined the KGB during a Red 5 interval, and he quit the KGB during a Red 5 interval. And of course, like I showed you, he got married during a Red 5 interval, and his mother was born during a Red 5 interval. What could happen now? All right, now we jump ahead, not 8 years, and it's 1999, and his father dies during a Red 5 interval. In fact, his mother had only just died a few months earlier. We don't have an exact date for the mother's death, but his father definitely died during a Red 5 interval. And it's particularly interesting because right after, he literally buries his father, he goes to his father's funeral, and then he flies back to Moscow from St. Petersburg, and boom, right there, a few days later, right when he gets back from the funeral, Boris Yeltsin names him Prime Minister of Russia. And this is during a Red 5 interval. And it is because he's named Prime Minister that he's later going to take over in less than a year. By early the next year, he's going to take over as interim president when Yeltsin resigns at the end of the year, and then he's going to be elected president. And this begins really properly the Putin era. Now, when he's named prime minister, within about a month, war with Chechnya sort of gears up again. The second Chechnyan war gears up. And this has a lot to do with Putin. And a lot of what he winds up doing in the second Chechnyan war is a lot of the same stuff that we see, his forces doing in Ukraine today. Basically just destroying cities so that anyone who's not a combatant leaves, and anyone left in the city is deemed an enemy and taken out if possible. All right, so 8 years after this, it's 2007, and we're in a Red 5. And just a few months earlier, Putin had given this famous speech. It was during a Black 1 interval. He gave this famous speech in Munich where he sort of put his cards on the table vis-a-vis his view of Russia's place in the world. And with the Red 5, he goes personally to Guatemala to make an appeal for Russia to host the Winter Olympic Games in 2014. And if you see the video clip of this proposal, it's very, very interesting because he speaks English in it, and he actually speaks English pretty well. It's one of the only times that you get a clip of him speaking English. Anyway, Russia was seen as a long shot to host the Olympic Games, but they wound up getting it thanks to Putin's appeal here. And this was important, of course, because Russia had last hosted the Winter Games in 1980, and the U.S. had boycotted it because of the war in Afghanistan. So this was seen as like sort of a chance to revive what could have been in 1980 when the Soviet Union hosted the Olympics. Funny enough, right after the Olympics ended in 2014, Russian troops invaded the Crimea and annexed it. Not all the troops were Russian military troops. Some of them were private soldiers, which is another tactic that's being used in Ukraine right now. But this was during a Red 4 interval. And of course, like I said, 8 years later, February 22nd of this year, during a Red 4 interval, I don't have a chart for it, but the war began during a Red 4 interval once again. Oh, and finally, getting back to the red 5, the last time there was a red 5 interval was in the summer of 2015. So this is after Putin has annexed Crimea, and Putin and Obama encounter each other at the UN, and Putin basically came out on top. He didn't make Obama look too good at the United Nations. It was sort of a nadir in terms of this whole relationship. Of course, a year later, Putin's going to have someone he likes a whole lot more in Obama's place, but that's neither here nor there. Basically, what I wanted to point out with all of this is number one, the case that the red 5 interval in Putin's life, the interval that his mother was born under, that his father died under, that he got married under, that he joined the KGB under, that he quit the KGB under, that he was named to the prime ministership under, began his leadership reign under. All these things occurred during red 5 intervals. Obviously, that interval appears to be always very, very central in Putin's life. Secondly, the red 1 interval, as I was showing you, even though it's been a while, does seem to have a significant place in the political murders of Russian leaders. At least historically it has. So as we're moving forward, obviously, the war, I'm not going to get into saying anything about the war itself. I mean, it speaks for itself. It's horrible. It's grisly, likely to sort of just carry out in some form or another for quite some time. But as we're moving forward, I want to, just point out that the next red 5 interval will be in the summer of 2023, just a little over a year from now. And the next red 1 interval will be in the spring of 2025. So as these things drag on, as we're wondering where they're going, I just want to highlight those periods in the calendar and suggest that maybe, just maybe, we're going to see this whole story come to some new crossroads when we get to those points in the synodic cycle again. That's basically it. I could go on and on. I see someone has a question about Putin's birthday. We'll get to that in a minute. I have a whole other thing on Lenin, a whole other thing on Stalin. They're also very interesting. I can go further back with the Romanovs and the different czars. It's also very interesting. I could talk about World War II, in the same way I spoke about the First World War. But I don't want to overwhelm you folks. I just wanted to give you a little taste of what I'm doing, of how to use this system and maybe how to look at geopolitics using it. And now I guess I'll turn the floor over to questions. I see Taylor here is asking, I wonder if we can rectify to a red 5 2 years before Putin's birthday we have. No, there was a red 5 a year before Putin was born, but the suggested alternate birthday places him as a blue 2 if he was born in 1950. Which is interesting because Stalin was a blue 2. Stalin was the only blue 2 that Russia ever have, and Putin is the only black 2 that Russia has ever had. So I mean, that's the one thing, I guess, if it's true that Putin's birthday is a lie, then it's most likely in 1950, making him a blue 2, more like Stalin. Gail's asking if I could say a little bit more about the upcoming red periods. Let me put up a grid here. Whoops, this is not what I wanted to do. Okay. So I have a lot of different people lined up with this. I'm going to change slides and open a different one so I can talk about the red ones. Okay. So the red fives sorry, I just have trouble locating my mouse when there's all these windows open. So you can see this is a sort of chronological list of all the red five intervals going from the year 1667 right up until 2031. So if you look in the bottom right corner, you can see the last few Venus red five intervals that we've had. 1999, 2007, 2015. And then finally, the next one is going to be in 2023, between June and October. And then in 2031, again, from late May to October to late October. So those will be the two red fives. The 2023 one, the second to last one at the bottom right corner, is the one that is the next one, just a little over a year away. And that's the period that again, you saw for yourself, that is always a really critical interval in Putin's life, which is why I just, and it's usually sort of beginnings and endings, birth of his mother, death of his father, join the KGB, quit the KGB, so on and so forth. And the other interval, it's the red one that follows that. You can see the last time we had the red one interval was in from January to June of 2017, and we'll have it again from January to June 2025. And that's the one that, again, although it's been quite a while since this happened, it's the one that we typically sort of link to major Russian political assassination. If things were to go in that direction, that would be my sort of guess about. Again, sorry to be a bit morbid here, but I guess we are in wartime. That would be sort of, if that kind of thing is going to happen, that's when I would expect it to happen. Now I'm having trouble with the chat here. I'm trying to scroll down in the chat. There we are. Okay, so many slides in the way. Specific date regarding Putin's alternate date of birth. It's the same birthday. It's the same birthday, just a different year. The story is that Putin would have been too old or too young to start in school. He was the wrong age to start in school, so she had to lie about his age to sort of make the story fit. It would be interesting to look at the U.S. president's charts and their correspondences with Russia during certain periods. Yeah, it would. Where can we find charts or a table if we're curious to look into this more? I've got all the charts and tables. Why don't I just pull up? It might take a minute to upload, but I can look at oh, that's going to take a while to download. Shoot. Well, maybe I'll do it while we talk about other things, and hopefully it opens in time. But I can tell you, American presidents, there haven't been that many red interval ones, but a lot more in the 20th century than there were, say, in the 19th century. In the 20th century, you began, actually, McKinley and Roosevelt were both red too. And then you had a whole string of them. Franklin Roosevelt was a blue 4, but so many people under him were born in red intervals, like, on his staff and stuff. But then Truman was a red 3, Eisenhower a red 2, Kennedy a blue 1, Johnson a red 3, Nixon a black 2, Ford a white 5. And there's interesting things. I wish I should have had this. Oh, it's downloading pretty quickly. Maybe we will be able to. I will be able to show you, because there are some very interesting things with American presidents and the intervals. For instance, red threes, I showed you all those red threes at the beginning. The three American red three presidents were Harry Truman, Lyndon Johnson, and George H.W. Bush, all three of whom are vice presidents who later went on to the presidency. There are some other interesting links between them where, if I get the charts up, I'll show you. Ford being a white 5, that's very common. The white 5s are very common, mostly with single term presidents, I think not Cleveland, not Benjamin Harrison. When they come up, I'll have to touch on that. Hopefully this downloads fast enough and I can get on that. I'll come back to that. Okay, Carter's a white 2. Okay, I just want to answer Taylor's other question here. I apologize if you said this before, and if so, I can rewatch the recording, but do the color correspond to a certain element, modality, or quality of time? Not really, not like you're thinking of, the zodiac. I mean, the white intervals are morning star, the black intervals are evening star. That's sort of self-explanatory. The red intervals, it really has to do with speed. Venus changes speed over the course of its cycle. When it's in the white interval, it's gradually accelerating. When it's in the black interval, it's gradually decelerating. In the blue interval, it's really speeding up to the sun. It's at its fastest. And then when it's in its red interval, it's doing its retrograde, which means, slowing down, stopping, turning around, accelerating a bit, and then stopping again, and slowing down and stopping again, then turning around again. So the colors really have more to do with that, with the 4 types of visibility, whether Venus is rising before the sun or after the sun, and the speed it's making, as opposed to, anything sort of more esoteric. What period was it when Russia entered the war in Afghanistan? Thanks. The Afghanistan war began in a white 2 interval. But it's that's the invasion. The invasion really started because of a political murder that happened in 1978 during a blue 4. The Afghanistan war, yeah, I've read a fair amount about it. But they didn't invade during a red 4. But the red 4 was really hot during the Afghanistan war. That would have been early 1982. That's sort of when that's certainly like, the U.S. was sending weapons along at that point and stuff. So the Afghanistan war is another sort of thing to tackle in all this. Now this thing's moving slowly again. A shame. I should have opened it before, but hopefully it speeds up and I can show you American presidents. I don't know how much time have I got left.
You've got a bunch of time left if you want it. It's
okay,
up to you.
all right. I'm getting a little bit hoarse, but I would like to show this American president's file.
And we will remind people that where you're speaking from is now after 11 p.m.
That's right. Yeah, I'm in Cape Town, just about 5 minutes from the Cape of Good Hope, in beautiful South Africa. So it's 11:15 at night. So I am a little hoarse, alas. Let's see, do I have any other questions in the meantime? This presidential thing should be opening up soon. Now I hope the audience is, I know Russian history is dense. It's not necessarily everyone's cup of tea. But this is, I've been studying Russian astrology, Russian history with astrology for a long time now. And although I'm not happy about the war, the war has given me the opportunity to, or it has at least suggested to me that if I don't show this material now, I might lose the chance for anyone to ever find it interesting. So I hope you have. Yeah, there is a lot of other stuff too. I don't know if I should have gone into some of the Bolshevik stuff with Lenin and Stalin. Shame. I wish I wasn't making you wait for this presidential one. It is worth it. What other questions about either Russia or US are coming to people's minds while we wait for this last bit of the download?
Well, Nick, on a technical note, rather than bother to type it, I just unmuted myself. Earlier, you were talking about the greatest elongation of Venus, and I know what that is. I had to stop and think about it for just a minute, but I'm not sure if all the astrologers would realize what in terms of the height above the horizon. Would it take 20 seconds and explain that? There's probably a few people that would appreciate it.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Frank. Basically, when Venus is doing its retrograde, I had a little video of that. When Venus slows down to make its retrograde and it stops and the sun keeps going, just sort of like prior to that, as it's slowing down to stop, it winds up being at the greatest distance from the sun that it ever gets over the course of its cycle, about 46, 47 zodiacal degrees away, which is why we never see Venus more than 2 signs ahead of the sun, or 2 signs before or after the sun in a chart. So when Venus reaches that greatest distance from the sun, before the retrograde in the west, after the retrograde in the east, it happens to correspond within a day or so of when when the red intervals begin and end. That was determined just by a mathematical thing, dividing the cycle into 20 equal parts, and using the red intervals, beginning them at with the interior conjunction in the middle of the interval, so that there's 73 days on either side, and those 73 days happen to bring me within a day or so of Venus being at its greatest elongation. So there's something something in the cycle itself, the sort of the symmetry of the cycle, that even includes the distance from the sun into this. They basically mark off quarters of this, round circle. Hopefully it works better when I use a diagram to explain it, but I hope that makes sense to people. We're really, really close to this thing being ready now. It's at 19.
And Nick, the last time you spoke for us, you mentioned that Russia, the U.S. Goes to war with Uranus in Gemini, but you mentioned, I think it was Uranus going, the association with Uranus being in certain signs. It might have been another planet.
Yeah, no, it was. Uranus's transit through Gemini. Basically, okay, in the 18th century, Uranus entered Gemini in 1774, and it left in 1782. So you've got perfectly the beginning and the end of the Revolutionary War with Britain. And then if you jump ahead 84 years, Uranus was in Gemini from 1858 to 1866, perfectly bookending basically the Lincoln-Douglas debates and the entirety of the Civil War, ending just as the Civil War ends. And then if you go ahead another 84 years, Uranus is in Gemini from the years 1941 to 49, perfectly bookending the US entry into the Second World War, right up until just before when the Soviet Union gets the atom bomb. In other words, sort of the US entry into the Second World War is this largely isolationist power, emerging on the other side of the transit as at the time, the sole superpower on the globe. So there is something to be said about the US entering major wars when Uranus is in Gemini. And these are always wars that redefine what the US is. I mean, obviously the American Revolution created the United States. It made something out of nothing. The Civil War transformed the American government to something a lot more centralized, the United States of America. And then the Second World War transformed the US from being, like I said, largely an isolationist power into being this global superpower. So there's something transformative about these wars. It generally involves a war, but it's more than a war. It's a transformation. All right, so here we are with the presidents. Why don't I put this on full screen here? This is their death signs. Sorry, I also look at presidential death. These are their natal Venus signs. This chat window is really inconvenient. I can never move it out of the way. Maybe I'll just close it for now. Whoops. That wasn't what I meant to close. Okay. So this is their natal Venus signs. You can see, okay, a lot of Cancer and Pisces, but for the most part, largely sort of distributed quite evenly. The 10 phases, mostly evenly, although there's only ever been one white A president. That was McKinley. But then when we get to the 20 intervals, not unlike what I was showing you with the Russian czars, it's a really uneven distribution amongst the presidents. A lot more black 2 and a lot more white 5 than anything else. And there's something interesting about the way these guys get grouped. For instance, the white 5s, Harrison, Taft, Harding, Ford, and then Obama. Now, the first 4 of those are all single-term presidents. And the first 3 of them, like Harrison, Taft, and Harding, even though they're one-term presidents, they're presidents who wound up naming a lot of judges. I think Taft named like 5, and Harrison and Harding. So even though they're seen as generally, less consequential one-term presidents, they're presidents who happen to name a lot of judges. The mold is obviously broken with Obama, although he's got his own controversies with regard to naming judges, i.e. Not getting to name one that he was probably entitled, that he was definitely entitled to. You can also see that there were never very, very many black 3 presidents until recently. 3 out of the last 4 black 3 presidents, 3 of the last 4 presidents were black 3s. And prior to that, the only black 3 president we ever had was Hoover. And there's interesting things, like I said, Truman, Johnson, and Bush 1 are all red 3s. Johnson and Bush, it's interesting, they're red 3s. Johnson nominated, oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank on his name, Thurgood Marshall, who was also a red 3 to the Supreme Court. And he nominated him during a red 5 transit. And then 24 years later, in 1991, Bush 1, who's a red 3, nominated Clarence Thomas, who's a red 3, during a red 5 transit. But not only was Clarence Thomas a red 3, so is Anita Hill. So Bush 1, Clarence Thomas, and Anita Hill are all red 3s. Lyndon Johnson and Thurgood Marshall, also both red 3s. So there's weird, just like I was showing you with the First World War, there's this weird sort of gathering of certain intervals in certain situations that I find really interesting. There haven't been a lot of US presidents born during red intervals, but I do find interesting that the Truman, Eisenhower to Johnson period, that Cold War period, where there suddenly were a lot of, 3 out of 4 presidents were born during red intervals. And that was at a time when all the major leaders were born during red intervals. Mao was a red 4. Khrushchev was a red 4. The British prime ministers, Churchill was a red 2. So was the guy who succeeded him. And then Anthony Eden was a red 1. And the guy after him, Harold, I'm drawing a blank, was a red 4. Basically, yeah, Britain, de Gaulle was a red 2. So if you're looking at like the Cold War years, late 40s, the 50s, the 60s, most of those major war leaders are all born during red intervals. Khrushchev was a red 4. He's replaced by Brezhnev, who's a red 2. So it's really astounding in that sense. And of course, you had the presidents, Truman, Eisenhower, and Johnson, all being born during red intervals. So that's something about the Cold War that, again, kind of like the First World War, you suddenly had all the key players were born during red intervals. Did I leave something out? Oh, and then this is, this is the deaths. The deaths of President. Oops, I keep closing that by accident.
Hi, Nick. This is Taylor.
Hi, Taylor.
I was just wondering, thank you. This is a really great informative presentation. I'm just wondering if I wanted to download the charts for all of the red, white, blue, black periods. Do you have that available for purchase somewhere? Or
yeah, I've never
somewhere?
made it. I've never made it available in that way. My plan is eventually to make a series of YouTube videos and present it that way. And maybe offer PDFs to Patreon subscribers, things like that. So I've been sort of holding off for that, but I do intend to release this material. There's a lot of it. So it also, it needs organizing. But if there's anyone in particular, like I could send you a few in an email. If there's anyone in particular that you're interested in looking at. I'm not ready to just sort of send the several hundred-page document with all the slides to anybody just now. But I am moving towards distributing it somehow. It's just a matter of like really figuring out how to do it. Yeah, send me an email if you do want me to send you a few slides. I'm happy to just do that informally. These are our American deaths, American presidential deaths here. Not again, since I already waded into the morbid pool, I may as well just sort of splash around now that I'm in the water. Like I was saying, there's a lot more red 1 death and white 2 death compared to these other groups. This is something that bears more research. Again, with only with 20 different intervals, it's kind of staggering that out of all the presidents who've lived, 10 of them died during either a red 1 or a white 2 interval, out of only 45 men. So yeah, that's interesting. I noticed I made these slides before Biden was elected, which is, if you're wondering why he's missing, it's not like some kind of anti-Biden thing. I just have to update the slides, and I wasn't expecting to talk about presidents. Of course, he's not in this one because he's not dead, but in the previous one I was looking at. But yeah, I'm starting to get a bit hoarse. I'm sort of running out of steam here. I see there are more questions. Any comments on the Ukraine declaring independence from Russia in 1918, then becoming independent nation in August of 1991? Only that when it declared independence from Russia in 1918, that was during a red 4, and then it declared its independence in August of 91 during a red 5. That's another reason to suspect maybe this, this red 5 in 2023 could be a real sort of major turning point for the Ukraine as well as for Putin. The interesting thing about Ukraine is they are really, it is a really ancient country. I mean, Kyiv was sacked by Mongols, you know, at a time when, well, St. Petersburg simply didn't exist, and Moscow was nothing more than like a little village, an inconsequential village. Kyiv was already a sort of a major city being sacked by Mongols. They, you know, it's not their first rodeo. It's part of the reason Putin sees Russia and Ukraine as being part of this larger united body. Is, you know, nearly 1,000 years ago, quite a few hundred years ago, back in the 1200s or so, the Kievan Rus, the people we think of Russians today, were centered more in Kiev and in present day Ukraine than in the typical places we think of today, Moscow and St. Petersburg. So that's sort of part of the amazing history. I'm reading more and more about Ukrainian history because it's so vast, and there's a lot to pick up there. So apart from, you know, what we can say about 1918 and 1991 and how Ukraine Ukraine seems to be you know, caught in the cycle in the same way Russia is, it just remains to be seen. But one way or the other, I do expect 2023 to be, you know, quite a big deal when we get there. Where was Venus when Reagan's attempted assassination occurred? It was a blue 1. So the flip side to the red 1 interval, it was a blue 1 interval. Yeah, which is not, that's a whole other talk, not specifically about American history, but a lot of sort of uprisings and riots and what have you occur in years when you go from a blue 1 to a black 5 to a red 4. I already mentioned, you know, the Bolshevik Revolution was black 5. The Chinese Revolution was a black 5. The tearing down the Berlin Wall was black 5 going into a red 4. The French Revolution was blue 1. By the time, when they were, the Bastille was blue 1, but then all the stuff that followed right after, making the king and queen go back to Paris from Versailles, all that stuff was during a black 5. So the black 5 is, the blue 1, black 5 is kind of a hot period. Reagan was shot during a blue 1, but that was the same, you know, later that year, the Egyptian president was shot. Sadat was murdered, and you know, it tends to be a hot period. All right, well, I'm hoarse. I'm really losing my voice. I've really enjoyed this. Unless anyone else has some closing questions that I can get to quickly, I think I'm a spent force now.
I just want to say, when Venus rose holoically in January, I mean, before the sun, it is a warrior goddess. Oftentimes wars are started. We go to war after Venus rises likely, and this time in Capricorn. I mean, and you said that, I think it was the sign Capricorn that was connected with Russia in some way. Or you mentioned Uranus in Gemini with the U.S., and there was another planet in.
Yes, Uranus in Capricorn in Russian history has a similar feel to it that Uranus in Gemini has in U.S. history. Uranus was in Capricorn in the late 80s, early 90s when the Soviet Union fell apart. Prior to that, Uranus was in Capricorn in the first decade of the 20th century when the first Russian Revolution happened. Right when the first Russian Revolution began in 1905 was when Uranus ingressed into Capricorn that time. And then prior to the prior transit of Uranus in Capricorn before that was in the 1820s, which is exactly when Alexander I is negotiating, you know, the Concert of Europe after the defeat of Napoleon. Alexander I is sort of this very enlightened ruler raised by his grandmother, Catherine the Great. But the Greek Revolution happens and he's suddenly sort of stunned You know, Europeans can't handle any more revolutions. They're scared that it's going to be France all over again. And so he becomes very conservative, you know, virtually overnight. And Russia doesn't participate in the Greek, the Greek Revolution. And that's sort of a turning point. That's Russia sort of becoming very conservative again after a period of promising progressive thought. And that is something that's going to sort of haunt them down the road. But in other words, yeah, whenever Uranus is in Capricorn, it does seem to be a really pivotal and poignant time in the country's history and their structure, all that stuff. Also, when Uranus was in Capricorn in the 1820s, there was, when Alexander died, there was the Decembrist revolution. So the first sort of populist sort of uprising after the defeat of Napoleon and all that stuff that was brutally put down. Sorry.
It's the Venus red one, or, you know, Venus are in this red zone. It's rising likely in Capricorn. I mean, we could say that was even more connected with maybe Russia going to war.
Yeah. Yeah, quite possibly. Yeah, the Venus retrograde station this time, it's stationed retrograde conjunct Pluto. Whereas last time in 2014, when they annexed Crimea, it was the direct station that was conjunct Pluto. So there is this sort of connection between the previous red 4 in 2014 and this red 4 in that both involved a station with Pluto, just, you know, the different ones. The direct last time, the retrograde this time.
Right, Nick. We know that you're ready to call it a day. We really appreciate your coming on and doing this lecture for us. Very, very interesting. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for you know, sitting through all the Russian history. I hope you found it interesting. Taylor, like I said, my email should be available through the group. Is it not? Or I can also be reached at my website, nickdaganbestastrologer.com. You can write me through the website, and, you know, if you want me to send you some slides, I'm happy to send some.
Excellent presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you so much. How many of us are there now? I can't even tell.
There's been from 15 to 17, 18 people on today, but others that registered that couldn't be here, and we'll get the link to our YouTube.
Also amazing video and audio quality coming from South Africa in a Mercury retrograde. Oh my God.
Oh, good. Good.
Very impressive. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. All right, everyone. Well, my love to Tucson. I really miss you guys. I hope the next time I give a talk, it's back in your lovely city again. I have amazing memories from my time there that I'll never forget. Say hi to Catherine Basket for me. She hosted me last time. I'm sure someone in your group has sees her regularly. But yeah, all the best to you, Tucson.
Thank you very much, Nick. Be well.
You too.